Professor Christensen, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jerry. I appreciate the opportunity to again talk a bit about World War II Japanese ciphers. So there are many World War II Japanese naval codes and ciphers. This happens to be the list at the end of 1944. Now, JN, of course, designates Japanese naval, and JNA designates Japanese naval attaché. When we last discussed Japanese ciphers, we explored JN25. JN25 was the primary Japanese naval cipher. It was the fleet general purpose cipher. It was 5-digit code that was enciphered by additives. JN25 was introduced on the 1st of June, 1939, and it was in use throughout the war. Today, what I want to look at is JN157 and its predecessors. JN157 was a machine cipher. It was a cipher that was used to communicate among large naval installations and among some ships. Before looking at the cipher, maybe we should call several things about the way the Japanese language can be expressed in writing. Probably the most familiar way of Japanese writing is kanji, Chinese characters. Kanji is a very precise way to express ideas. There are two other sets of characters that together are referred to as kana, hiragana and katakana. Kana characters are phonetic. They express the sounds of Japanese syllables. Now, the same sounds can be expressed using either hiragana or katakana. The problem with kana is that it's very common for several kanji characters to sound the same, and therefore to be written the same using kana. So a person who's reading a message written in kana must often determine meaning based on context, and that can be difficult. Another way to write Japanese is called romaji. In this case, Roman letters are used to express the sounds of kana characters. All of the expressions you see on this slide are writing for Tokyo. So the World War II Japanese ciphers primarily used either katakana or romaji. Today, I want to focus on a series of cipher machines that enciphered kana. The kana machines were used by Imperial Japanese Navy to communicate, as I said, among major shore facilities and among some ships. But we'll also mention some siblings of those machines that enciphered using romaji. The romaji machines were used primarily by Japanese diplomats or by naval attachés. Those were people who often had to send messages using commercial telegraph, and therefore they needed to send messages written in Roman letters. Now, ciphertext in romaji can, of course, be transmitted using International Morse code. But there's also Morse code that can be used to transmit ciphertext in kana. On this slide, we see the katakana characters, their romaji equivalents, and the corresponding kana Morse code. Now, although today katakana is used primarily for foreign words, when kana Morse was developed, katakana was the more common of the two kana alphabets. I want to focus on 3 Imperial Japanese Navy kana cipher machines. The first is a machine called IKA. Little is known about the machine itself, but the cryptographic elements of the machine are known. Now, the early history of Japanese cipher machines is fairly muddled. US Navy documents begin with IKA. However, there seem to have been some earlier machines. IKA was followed by a machine that the US Navy designated M1, or orange. Orange was one of a series of 3 cipher machines called the 1931 series. The most familiar of that series was the Romaji machine designated red that was used by Japanese diplomats. But there was also another Romaji machine designated the M2 that was used by Japanese naval attaches. Orange was followed by a machine designated JADE by the US Navy. JADE was one of a series of 3 cipher machines called the 1937 series. Purple, which is also part of that 1937 series, is probably the most famous of the Japanese cipher machines. It had replaced red and was a Romaji machine used by diplomats. Another Romaji machine, Coral, replaced the M2 and was used by the Japanese naval attaches. So we were going to look at Ika, Orange, and Jade, but we'll also look at their siblings. So first I want to explore the cryptographic ideas of the Ika machine. Cryptographic principles of Ika are similar to the cryptographic principles of the Kriya cipher machine. That machine appeared around 1924, was designed by Alexander von Kriya, an immigrant to Germany. Looking at the top of the machine, we see 2 copies of the alphabet. One copy of the alphabet appears on the top cover of the machine, and another 2 copies appear on a rotor that turns counterclockwise. As the alphabets slide against one another, then the different substitutions are created. Plain text is on the semicircle, and ciphertext is on the rotor. So in this case, the alphabet in its usual order is lined up against itself. I'm thinking of plain text as being in white, that's on top of the machine, and the ciphertext in orange on the rotor. And I'm imagining as if the rotor is turning counterclockwise. So the orange letters are sliding to the right. When the rotor turns one position counterclockwise, then these are the new substitutions. Turning one more position, substitutions become these. Then one more position, then one more position. Altogether, there are 26 possible alphabets. After 26 steps of one position each, the substitutions will return to the starting position. Therefore, the period is 26. Now, in this case, I've only shown the first 9 alphabets. The patterns we see in the table, the diagonal patterns, are those of the well-known Vigenère cipher. The Roman letters in the alphabet on Kriya, they can be removed and arranged in other than the usual order. They slide out and can be put in a different place. That ordering is often called the sequence. So this is an enciphering table for Kriya with a sequence based on an Abwehr key. Again, the diagonal patterns are noticed. The stepping between the alphabets, however, is not regular. After a letter is enciphered, the button on the front of the Kriya machine is pushed, and the alphabets step in a way that's determined by a control wheel that's installed in the machine. And that motion is spring-driven. So here's the stepping for one of the control wheels. So the first time the alphabets step by 7 positions, then 6 positions, then 7 positions, and so forth. That irregular stepping breaks up the pattern of the enciphering table and extends the period. The starting position of one alphabet against another is also part of setting up the machine. In this case, with the alphabets in the usual order, plaintext A in the white row is lined up against ciphertext Q in the orange row. The Kriha machine was weak, even for its time. It was evaluated and rejected by the US Army cryptologist Parker Hitt. Challenge ciphers were broken by William Friedman's Signal Intelligence Service team. And a 1931 US Navy pamphlet by Lawrence Safford described its solution. We know that the Japanese acquired Kriha and Enigma in the 1920s. IKA seems to have been based on the cryptographic principles of Kriha. So those principles were sequencing of the alphabet, irregular stepping, and the setting of the alphabets against one another. So let's look how Kriha enciphered. An actual machine was never captured. So as we mentioned before, Kriha used kana characters. The kana alphabet was split into two pieces. A minor alphabet consisting of 7 characters, which you're seeing, which include non-kana character X, and 2 diacritical marks, nigori and hanagori, that change the kana characters. The 7 characters in this minor alphabet were always substituted as shown on this slide. It was a fixed substitution. The remaining 42 kana characters form the major alphabet. Now, like on the Kriha machine, the major alphabet was sequenced. The characters were put in order. And part of setting up the machine was to sequence the alphabet. Each of the sequences was in effect for a month. Let's look at stepping. This is the beginning of the major alphabet. Like on Kriha, it will step against itself. Again, plaintext is in white and ciphertext is in orange. The ciphertext slides against plaintext. Arbitrarily, key has been chosen as the beginning of the alphabet, and that's marked in red. So the machine steps one position. It steps another position. If the stepping were regular, the period would be 42. But like Kriha, the stepping is irregular. But the stepping is not determined by an unchangeable control wheel like on Kriha. It's set on a 47-pin brake wheel. When a pin's in position, the alphabet steps by one position. If a pin is removed, the alphabet skips one and steps 2 positions. If 2 consecutive pins are removed, then the alphabet steps 3 positions. The number of pins that are removed, that is, those that are inactive in their locations, is determined by a set of 50 keys, which also includes the starting position. So if a pin is inactive, the alphabet steps by 2 positions. Pin is active, pin is active, 2 consecutive pins are inactive, the alphabet steps by 3 positions. And again, this irregular stepping lengthens the period. Now, it's also necessary to set the starting position of plain text against the ciphertext. So here's an ECOM message. The sender serial number 608 is in the upper left. It's part of the heading. Repeated after the 608 is the last 2 digits, the 08. Those digits determine the key for setting up the machine. And remember, the key determines which pins are active or inactive, and also the starting position. So let's look at the 1931 series of machines. The cryptographic principles that are seen in these machines are similar to the cryptographic principles of cipher machines that were designed by Swedish inventor Arvid Damm, who experimented with cipher machines during the 1910s and patented a machine in 1919. Now, after Damm's death in 1927, Boris Hägglund bought Damm's company. In 1930 or maybe early 1931, two Japanese naval officers visited Hägglund's plant. Suspecting that they only wanted to buy some samples to copy, Hägglund told them they had nothing available. But they noticed two of Damm's obsolete cipher machines, and they bought those. Now, the visit to Hägglund is important because three principles that Damm used in his cipher machines appear in the 1931 series of Japanese cipher machines. One of those principles was that ciphertext was pronounceable. Now, along with the introduction of the telegraph in the second half of the 19th century came the introduction of commercial telegraph codes. Because the cost of telegrams was based on the number of words, commercial codes were employed to make the messages more compact. Now, some of those codes also were designed for error detection or to keep content secret. Until 1932, strings of letters that were not pronounceable were charged at a higher rate than strings of letters that were pronounceable. The criteria to be pronounceable was determined by the ratio of vowels to consonants in the string of letters. And the required ratio was based on the ratios in languages that were commonly used in telegraphic communications. So cipher machines create artificial words, but if the enciphering process resulted in pronounceable words, then the ciphertext message could be sent at a cheaper rate. So some of Damm's cipher machines were designed to produce pronounceable ciphertext. The 1931 series Japanese cipher machines that enciphered in Roman letters, those that were used by the Japanese diplomats and naval attachés who sent their messages by commercial telegraph, did produce pronounceable ciphertext. Now, Japanese written in Romaji is pronounceable. Syllables typically consist of a consonant followed by a vowel. Therefore, an easy way for the Japanese to produce pronounceable ciphertext was to encipher the vowels as vowels and the consonants as consonants and keep the ratios the same. The two 1931 series Romaji cipher machines, red, that was used by the diplomats, and the M1 that was used by the naval attachés, they split the Roman alphabet into two sets: the 6 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and Y, and the 20 consonants. And of course, the split was called the 6s and the 20s. Each set was enciphered differently, separately. The second principle that the 1931 series cipher machines shared with Damm's cipher machines was the Damm half rotor, or the mushroom wheel. The half rotor consists of a rod with a disc on one end. Along the rod are slip rings through which the electrical charge from the plain text typewriter enters. The slip rings are wired to outputs on the half rotor's disc. In the top diagram, when the letter Y is typed on the keyboard, the electrical charge enters the slip ring that corresponds to the letter Y, which is wired to output letter D. Electrical charge exits the half rotor at the position corresponding to D, which in this diagram is in contact with ciphertext letter J. So lamp J lights, and J is a ciphertext substitution for Y. Then the half rotor steps one position clockwise. Now, if the letter Y is typed again, the electrical charge still enters the slip ring corresponding to the letter Y, which is wired to output letter D. Electrical charge still exits the half rotor at the position corresponding to D, but now D is in contact with ciphertext letter I. So lamp I lights. I is now the ciphertext substitution for Y. The difference between the full rotor and half rotor is that in the full rotor, both the input and output positions change. In the half rotor, the input position remains fixed, but the output position changes. If I followed Y around the rotor, these would be the encipherments of Y. So the enciphering table for a half rotor looks like this. And once again, it's got that diagonal pattern that we associate with the Vigenère cipher. Now, because the Romaji machine split the alphabet into two sets, the 6s and the 20s, there were two separate enciphering tables for those machines. And the enciphering of the 6s and of the 20s could be attacked separately. These are images of two half rotors that were in a US Navy constructed analog of one of the Romaji machines. The half rotor for the 6s is on the left, and the half rotor for the 20s is on the right. Like with ECA, irregular stepping, skipping of some alphabets, was used to lengthen the period. Again, a 47-pin brake wheel was used. In this image, the brake wheel's on the right. Pins that you see on the right are in the active position. Those step the alphabet by 1. Pins that are on the left are inactive, and they skip alphabets. So the enciphering table looks like a Vigenère table with 1 or 2 rows skipped occasionally. So for the 1931 series of Japanese cipher machines, they employed pronounceable ciphertext, the Damm half rotor, and irregular stepping. So let's actually look at the machines. Again, the most well-known of the 1931 series is the diplomatic version, which was designated by the US Army Signal Intelligence Service as RED. It enciphered Romaji, and in order to keep ciphertext pronounceable, it split the Roman alphabet into the vowels and consonants, the 6s and 20s. This is a diagram of the cryptography of the machine. The boxed material on the right is a later modification that was added to provide additional security. RED was attacked by the US Army Signal Intelligence Service. In 1921, William Friedman became the chief cryptanalyst for the US Army Signal Corps. In 1929, Herbert Yardley's Black Chamber, which had served as the cryptanalytic agency for both the War Department and the State Department, was dissolved, and its records were turned over to the Signal Corps. In 1930, Friedman made the first hires for the Signal Intelligence Service. His first 3 hires were mathematicians: Frank Rowlett, Abraham Sinkoff, and Solomon Kuhlbach. Now, the first RED messages were intercepted in March 1933, but the SIS attack on RED did not actually begin until late 1935. And in the interim, the Japanese machines had been broken by the Government Code and Cipher School. After the change in the telegraphic regulations dropped the special rate for pronounceable text, it was no longer necessary to split the alphabet into vowels and consonants. However, the machine was designed in such a way that the alphabet had to be split. So in setting up red, the alphabet was divided into a set of 6 letters and a set of 20, but it need not be the vowels and the consonants. Now, based on the analysis of ciphertext frequencies, it's typically easy to separate the 6s from the 20s based on their frequencies. In 1936, the Signal Intelligence Service intercepted a large amount of Japanese red traffic from Manchuria, where the Imperial Japanese Army had been fighting since 1931. An attack was made against traffic from December 1936. The attack proved unsuccessful, so the Signal Intelligence Service returned to 1933 intercepts in which the 6s were the vowels and the 20s were the consonants. Being able to recognize the vowels and the consonants, codebreakers were able to search for patterns, particularly vowel patterns, that were common in Romaji. The Army Signal Intelligence Service codebreakers needed a bit of help. The Navy had broken other 1931 series machines, so SIS approached the Navy's codebreaking section OP-20G for help. Navy Lieutenant Joseph Wenger mentioned that the machines they had broken had a 47-pin break wheel, and the SIS attack was soon successful. Now, what you see in the slide are 2 red analogs. Initially, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service didn't have enough money to build the mechanical analog and used instead an analog made of construction paper and later plastic. This analog was a 60-point disc with the 2 alphabets, the 6s and the 20s, arranged around the circumference. The 20s are on the outer ring and the 60s are on the inner ring. After 2 years, funds became available, and the Navy Yard Model Shop produced an electromechanical analog. It was designated by the Navy as RIP-13. RIP stood for Radio Intelligence Publication, or according to other sources, Registered Intelligence Publication. And it usually designated a document, but it was also used to designate some cryptanalytic devices. The M2 machine was also a Romaji machine and was used by Japanese naval attachés, and it might have been identical with red. This image, which is similar to the image of the RIP-13, the red analog, is of a device identified as RIP-60. RIP-60 designates the M2 analog, the analog for the Japanese naval attaché machine. And this is another image of the RIP-60. Now, our focus in the 1931 series of the Japanese cipher machines is on the kana version, the one that was used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. That was designated M1 or orange. It was first intercepted in 1933. Like the 2 Romaji machines, it split the plain text alphabet. But in this case, it was the kana alphabet. It split it into a minor alphabet of 14 characters and a major alphabet of 42 characters. It also employed a 47-pin break wheel, and it also sequenced the alphabets. Orange was broken by US Navy codebreaker Agnes Driscoll, and Jack Holtwig also participated in that attack. Two orange machines were captured at Rashin, Korea at the end of the war. One of those machines is now on display at the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade. This is part of that display. Now, unfortunately, the display is focused on the SIS attack on red, and the machine on the display is described as kana red rather than orange. Also in the display is a diagram of a portion of the machine, and the diagram seems to have been signed by Holtwig and to be the design of a portion of the orange analog. Holtwig designed an M1 or orange analog in 1935, but the device wasn't completed until 1937. Two analogs were constructed. On 13th of May, 1937, in a letter to Holtwig from Wenger, he mentions that a M1 analog and other material were being shipped to Pearl Harbor so that that station might take over the deciphering of M1 messages. However, the last definite M1 intercept had in fact occurred in March of 1937. So the orange machine enciphered kana and was used by the Imperial Japanese Navy for communication between major shore stations and some ships. First intercepted in 1933, and it replaced ICA. In March of 1937, it was replaced by one of the 1937 series of Japanese cipher machines, a machine which the Navy's Op-20G designated as JADE. So let's look at the cryptographic principles of 1937 machines. A major change occurred in the 1937 series. The Damm half rotor was replaced by telephone stepping switches. Six-level 25-position switches were used. Now, unfortunately, this image is not the correct size switch. An plain text input charge, electrical charge, which corresponded to a kana character or a Romaji character, would enter the shaft of the switch and pass to the level that corresponded to that plain text letter or character. Then it passed to the outside of the switch by means of a wiper that extended from the shaft to the output. In this image, a wiper is visible at the bottom of the diagram from the shaft to the edge of the switch. There should be a wiper on each level. Looking from the top, each output position was then wired to a ciphertext letter or character. The switch stepped to a new position as each letter or character was enciphered, and all of the levels stepped together. In this image, you can see the outputs and the top of the wipers. Now, the wipers permitted enciphering tables that did not have to have the patterns that occurred in enciphering tables for half rotors or full rotors. The diplomatic cipher machine red, when it was replaced in 1937 by purple, although there was no cryptographic reason to do so, the Japanese chose in purple to continue splitting the Roman alphabet into a set of 6 letters and a set of 20. Now, the split was the 6s and 20s, but need not be vowels and consonants. Let's consider an enciphering table for 6 vowels. This is going to be based on the using of a telephone stepping switch. The white letters are plain text. Each letter corresponds to one level of the switch. When the switch is in position 1, I choose to wire plaintext A to ciphertext Y, plaintext E to ciphertext E, plaintext I to ciphertext A, and so forth. When the switch steps to position 2, again, I'm free to choose whatever wiring I want. This time I choose to wire plaintext A to ciphertext I, plaintext E to ciphertext O, plaintext I to ciphertext Y, and so forth. Position 3, I can choose again, whichever outputs I want. Position 4, position 5, and this can be continued for 25 different positions. So there'll be 25 independent alphabets. There's no pattern as we go from one alphabet to another. Now, messages in purple began to be intercepted on the 20th of February, 1939, right after the machine went into use. Analysis of the frequencies of ciphertext letters of these early messages indicated that 6 letters had abnormally high frequencies. Signal Intelligence Service codebreakers were pleasantly surprised that the Japanese had retained Red's split of the alphabet into 6s and 20s. Therefore, they had a familiar place to start. By the 10th of April, 1939, they had recovered the enciphering table for the 6s. But the table didn't reveal any patterns from known cipher machines. As we said, the enciphering table consisted of 25 completely independent alphabets. A member of the Army's codebreaking team, electrical engineer Leo Rosen, constructed an analog for enciphering of the 6s. The machine was called the 6-buster. And he used a telephone stepping switch. He did not know that the Japanese had also used telephone stepping switches in their machine. But these telephone stepping switches produce regular stepping. And irregular stepping had been what was used to increase the period for the 1931 machines. In the 1937 machines, that was now replaced by the more commonly used composition of ciphers. Like the rotors in an Enigma machine. In this image, the composed enciphering of 3 small rotors is exhibited. Plaintext letters enter the rotor on the left. Depending on its position, the plaintext letter can exit at one of 6 positions, and therefore exit at one of 6 possible outputs. This is repeated for the second rotor and the third rotor. So there are 6 times 6 times 6 possible enciphering alphabets. The period of this composed cipher is 216. Although the Signal Intelligence Service had quickly determined the enciphering table for the 6s, they were stumped trying to determine the period of the 20s. On the 20th of September, 1940, about a year after their success with the 6s, Genevieve Groton, one of the SIS codebreakers, spotted ciphertext patterns that showed that the 20s resulted from regular stepping and from a composition of ciphers. 3 weeks after Groton's great discovery, SIS had recovered the purple cipher. So the 1937 series of Japanese cipher machines incorporated a sequence or plug board, telephone stepping switches, composition of ciphers, and regular stepping. So let's look at the machines. Purple is the most famous of the World War II Japanese cipher machines. Again, it enciphered Romaji. It was used by Japanese diplomats. The Roman alphabet was split into two sets, the 6s and the 20s. The 6s were enciphered by one 6-level 25 position stepping switch. There was a plug board on the input side and the inverse of the plug board on the output side. The 20s were enciphered by a composition of three 25 position telephone stepping switches. There's a plug board on the input side and an inverse on the output side. Now, unlike with Enigma, the order of switches couldn't be changed. You couldn't pick them up and move them like you could with Enigma rotors. Also, unlike Enigma rotors, any switch could be fast, any switch could be medium, and any switch could be slow. There are 6 possible motions. So this is one of the purple analogs. The U.S. Army provided 2 purple analogs to the Government Code and Cipher School. Useful information about the German order of battle was obtained by monitoring the purple enciphered communications of the Japanese ambassador to Germany, General Oshima Hiroshi. Coral was also a Romaji machine. It was used by the Japanese naval attachés. Coral was the best of the 1937 cipher machines. The alphabet was not split into the 6s and 20s. Encipherment was accomplished by composing 3 switches. There's a plug board on the input side and the inverse on the output side. But only 3 of the motions were possible. This is an image of a Coral analog. The US Navy designated it Python. Each of the 3 cabinets that you see on the desk contains one set of switches, and the lights on the cabinet show the 25 positions. The input typewriter is in the center, the output typewriter is on the left. The analog was designed and produced by the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory, which is located at the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio. Naval Computing Machine Laboratory also designed and produced the US Navy cryptologic bomb. Naval Computing Machine Laboratory produced an improved purple analog. This is on display at the National Cryptologic Museum. If it looks familiar, it should. It looks like Python. In fact, the cabinet bears Python's RIP number 114. The Navy repurposed a Python as an improved purple analog. The differences between the 2 machines are that there's a small box on top of the improved purple analog for the 6s switch, and there's a little horse on top of Python. Coral traffic was first intercepted on the 8th of September, 1939. But until the fall of 1943, US Navy codebreakers devoted little effort to attacking Coral. On the 30th of September, 1943, Bletchley Park results on Coral spurred the attack. And from October 1943 until March 1944, the attack consisted mostly of accumulating data, searching for patterns. During that time, the JADE crew was put out of work because of decreasing JADE traffic, and they transferred to Coral. And on the 13th of March, 1944, the wiring of Coral was recovered. Being able to read Coral traffic permitted Allied codebreakers to read the choral enciphered communications of Vice Admiral Abe Kasuo, who was the Japanese naval attaché to Germany, and also the Japanese representative to the Tripartite Military Commission. Abe's communications to Tokyo described in detail Germany's preparation for an Allied landing in Europe. JADE was the kana machine that replaced ECA in orange. The first JADE intercept was on the 1st of December, 1942, and Navy's OP-20G began to attack it immediately. JADE's enciphering mechanism consisted of 5 switches and a plug board. The first 3 switches advanced, but in only one of 3 possible orders, like choral. The last 2 switches, 4 and 5, they were set for each message, but they did not advance. The plug board was on the ciphertext side only, and US Navy questioned whether this was just an error in reading the design plans, that it should have been on both sides. JADE was a large machine. This machine was captured in June 1944 on Saipan, and it's on display in the National Cryptologic Museum. Now, the input keyboard is not visible in this image. But let's look a little bit more closely at JADE. JADE's keyboard can contain 25 keys and a shift key, so it doubled the number of characters. 25 characters in the major alphabet were the high-frequency kana, and the 25 characters in the minor alphabet were the low-frequency kana. The top is off this JADE machine. You can see 3 switches in the back and 2 switches in the front, one on the left, one on the right, and the plug board is between them. And this is a close-up of some of the switches in the plug board. So JADE came into use in December 1942. For some reason, there was a break in its use at the end of April 1943. A significant reduction in its use occurred after the capture of Kwajalein in early 1944. An even further reduction in use after a bombing of Rabaul. And the last JADE message was intercepted on the 30th of August, 1944. So JADE was broken by a US Navy team led by Francis Raven in the fall of 1943. The JADE analog was called Viper. Snake names were used for Japanese cipher machine analogs. There are 5 cabinets for the 5 switches. So let's try just a tiny bit of code breaking. I'm going to assume that the enciphering tables of the switches for JADE are known. This, for example, is the 3-wheel enciphering table, the switch on the right. Again, there are 25 independent alphabets. What the Navy had to determine to break messages was the motion. Remember, there are 3 possible motions. The output sequence, that plug board, and the settings of the switches. We're only going to determine the setting for switch 3. I'm going to assume the easiest case, 3-2-1 motion. What that means is switch 3, which is next to the input, is the fast switch. Switch 2 is the medium switch. Switch 1 is the slow switch. Switches 4 and 5 are set, but do not step. And the output plug board and switches 4 and 5 can all be thought of as one monoalphabetic substitution cipher that's just applied after the 3 switches. So again, I'm going to try to determine the setting for switch 3. It's important that this switch is next to the plain text input. It's the fast switch. Now recall that there is no plug board between the input and switch 3, and the attack exploits this. So I'm going to assume that we have known plain text. To simplify their documents, the Navy designated each of the 25 keys on the JADE keyboard by a letter of the Roman alphabet rather than its kana character. So that's what you see here. The trick is to locate 2 plain text letters that are close together and then encipher to the same ciphertext letter. Well, for example, in line 1, where the arrows are, in ciphertext positions 22 and 24, plain text U and ciphertext G, those are on the bottom, both encipher to plain text U and plain text G, both encipher to ciphertext M at an interval of 2. They're 2 apart. So let's look at the enciphering table for switch 3 to determine where that can happen. It's likely that what this means is that switch 3 enciphered plain text U and plain text G at an interval of 2 to the same letter. Not necessarily M, because there went through the plug board and switches after switch 3, but to the same letter at switch 3. When I look at the enciphering table for switch 3, there are 3 possibilities. U and G are enciphered to the same letter at an interval of 2 by switch 3 in positions 3 and 5. They're both enciphered to K. 17 and 19, they're both enciphered to N. And 20 and 22, they're both enciphered to T. So this UG repetition that occurs at positions 22 and 24 of the ciphertext probably results from the UG repetition at positions 3 and 5, 17 and 19, 20 or 22 of the enciphering table. So let's look at the possibilities. If the UG at positions 3 and 5 in the enciphering table, that's in orange, cause the repetition in the message, then switch 3 must have been set at position 7 to make the switch step to position 3 at position 22 of the message. So if I set the switch at position 7, then as I step, we get to position 3 at position 22 of the message. So position 3 of the enciphering table at position 22 of the message. So one possibility is the setting is at 7. If the UG at positions 3 and 5 in the enciphering table, or at position 17 and 19 in the enciphering table, cause a repetition in the message, then switch 3 must have been set at position 21 to make the switch step to position 17 at position 22 of the message. And finally, if UG at positions 20 and 22 of the enciphering table caused a repetition in the message, then switch 3 must have been set at position 24 to make the switch step to position 20 at position 22 of the message. So it looks like switch 3 must have been set to position 7 or 21 or 24. 3 possibilities. Let's try another position and see if that resolves the possibilities. On line 2, ciphertext O and C enciphered to the same letter in positions 10 and 15. C enciphers to U, O enciphers to U. In the switch 3 enciphering table, a CO repetition occurs at that interval only once. It's 16 and 21. They both encipher to U. So if CO at positions 16 and 21 in a enciphering table caused the repetition in the message, then switch 3 must have been set to position 7 to make the switch step to position 16 at position 10 of the message. So it appears that the starting position was 7. Now, a similar procedure can be applied to the other switches, not as easily. Again, not surprisingly, the US Navy did not initially recognize that JADE had 5 switches. Initially, they believed it had 3 switches and a monoalphabetic substitution cipher on the output side. But that's a little bit of JADE code breaking. So that's the story of ECA. Orange, and JADE and their siblings. So, thank you.
Do itashimashite. And I wonder if anybody has any questions at this point for Professor Christensen. So if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to put them in chat, or I can enable all of you to unmute if you want to put a question by voice. And it does seem that nobody wants to put their head over the parapet. So, okay, I'd like to say thank you for your talk. And I will just make a brief announcement of the next 2 talks that we'll be showing. So we've just enjoyed this one. We have 2 talks coming up on Tuesday, October 19th and Wednesday, October 20th. The one on October 20th is particularly interesting to me personally because it will feature Klaus Schmer and Ilonka Dunin, who are going to be talking about solving historical ciphers using modern means. And I should mention that Ilonka Dunin was sufficiently well known as a cryptographer that she appears in a Dan Brown book, albeit as an approximate acronym. That's not the word, is it? But with her name varied to make it fit the story, shall we say. So with that, I will bid everybody good night. Thank you for attending, and thank you, Professor Christensen.
Good night.